The announcement of Quake Champions reignited an age-old debate or discussion about whether or not Quake or Quake-style games, FPS shooters that aren't just like realistic Modern Warfare, Counter-Strike type ones, but actually the old school full-on ego shooter, arcade style game, whatever you want to call it, 1v1 for example, whether these types of games can be number one again in esports as they were at the genesis of esports back in the late 90s. Now, in terms of Quake Champions as a specific game and my thoughts on that and whether it can succeed, I'll do a separate video on that at a future time. This is a more generalized topic because, believe it or not, it's a topic that's come up again and again for over a decade. Basically, ever since Quake lost kind of the number one spot in esports to Counter-Strike in around 2001 when the CPL, Cyber Athlete Professional League, switched over to Counter-Strike. A number of leagues started to drop off their Quake support, and Counter-Strike had just become this grassroots phenomenon as a game that was just overtaking it in terms of player base and then encroached on the esports side, and you just basically saw the whole industry shift over to the Counter-Strike side, and Quake became a second or third tier, and then over the years a lower game, despite a short revival with IEM and Quake Live. So this discussion has happened again and again. It's just that the game that it's being compared to, the Quake style game, is always different. It's Counter-Strike, and then it's StarCraft 2, and it's League of Legends and Dota, and now it's CSGO and Overwatch. And so the game that they're comparing it to and saying, can we ever get back to where that game is, or can we ever be ahead of that game again, is always different, but the discussion has essentially always been the same throughout all of time. The problem that lies with this discussion is that before you ask what can Quake do or can Quake get to this position, you got to look at the context of the early days of Quake when it was the number one game. So first and foremost, why was Quake the number one game in terms of like big multiplayer games and esports, essentially, when esports admittedly wasn't even called esports, but it was just the first competitive gaming tournaments? Well, first of all, it technologically had massive advantages that put it ahead of other games. Like, for example, it had fantastic netcode early on. Like, one of the things that was good about the first Quake game was, believe it or not, in the early days, it meant that there almost were no other games which technologically could match what Quake brought to the game. Not just the netcode in terms of how the client itself interpreted things, which was obviously improved when Quake World came out, which was much better. Still to this day as one of the best netcodes of any game. Admittedly, doesn't have a whole of the same kind of ping compression or whatever you call it. No, the compression. I can't remember what you call it now, where it does compensation that certain other games do. But one of the actual technological advances of Quake was it was one of the first games to allow you to run the game over TCP/IP, essentially putting in an IP address to go to a server. And there, as a result, you could have like 16 players play. Before that, you had games like Doom, previous games by id Software, where you had to dial up via a modem. And you had to dial up to a specific person, and then there were people like Dwango who came along, who essentially you dialed into them, and then they had a server, and then a bunch of people could play. But even then, we're talking very small numbers of people. It was usually 1v1. As a result, some people were just playing on LAN, or they were just calling up other people. You had to know another person, know the number of their modem, call it directly. You weren't essentially playing over the internet, actually. You were just playing over the telephone line. Now, so netcode, TCP/IP, these were massive technological advances where Quake was ahead of the curve on this. So as a result, there weren't many other games like that. Also, the 3D engine. Quake was the game where people forget this. In Doom, you could only turn and you could only look forwards. You couldn't look up, you couldn't look down. If you shot, it just shot on a straight y-axis like this. You never actually went up on the y-axis, you just shot and it shot anywhere on that axis. So yeah, it was 3D, it had good netcode, it worked over TCP/IP. These were massive advantages at the time. These were innovations, evolutions of the genre of like FPS games that didn't exist, and therefore it had a massive step up on everyone else. Modern games obviously don't have such massive jumps technologically, because this is the equivalent of going from horses to having cars all of a sudden. Now then, it also, because of these technological advances, and how early on in the industry were of the concept of esports or multiplayer games, it was one of the only games that was out there that you really even could play or had any sort of multiplayer following. So, first of all, there was just a lack of other games, and as a result, other alternatives. So if you wanted to play online games, you wanted to play multiplayer games, and you wanted to play over the internet, you're already narrowing it down to like a handful of games, and it's basically going to be Quake out there. That's the popular one that everyone's heard of, and that's the one that everyone had bought anyway because they bought it for the single player. That's what Quake was created for, was the single player game. That's what id Software created. Now they tacked on the multiplayer, and much like with Doom, people started to play the multiplayer as well. The difference is the multiplayer for Quake then took off with its own lifespan, and the multiplayer for Quake has had more of an impact and is more remembered over the history of esports, obviously, than the single player is. The single player for Quake actually wasn't even that good compared to Doom. So that's another aspect to it that's quite interesting. Obviously, at the time, people didn't create games specifically for multiplayer. They just created single player games which had a multiplayer. And so in this particular sense, people actually weren't buying Quake for the multiplayer. They were buying it for the single player, first of all, then they had the option then to play the multiplayer. So essentially, people were already in the door, and at that point, it's free to play the multiplayer because you've already got the game, essentially. It's not the same as in the modern day world where you're buying it for the multiplayer. It's specifically what people are coming for, and games are made for multiplayer. So you've got to add in as well, esports was not big business at this point in time. So as a result, the first tournaments that became esports in the West, people always reference, by the way, that it's like, oh, Korea invented esports. Bullshit, they did. They invented their own variant of esports over there. And essentially, some aspects of how they invented it were sort of parallel thinking to what was going on in the West. Now, they got ahead in certain other areas and did things in a very Korean manner, but they did not invent esports. There were big, not big in the modern day context, but at the time, big Quake tournaments in the late 90s, from like 98 onwards, that were taking place that had prize money, and you had some famous players, and you had tournaments like we think of like a tournament now, but just without all the trappings of it, the sponsors, the teams, players who've been to a million tournaments before, famous matchups that were having again, obviously big production value, crowds. You didn't have any of these factors, but you had the very core, bare bones skeleton basics of esports at the time already in Quake, and it was mainly, obviously, in the 1v1 tournaments. And then people would have big LAN parties, and at those you might have the 4v4 tournaments as well, etc. And so the key point to make is, one of the reasons why Quake was number one in the esports sector initially was because when there was no esports, esports was essentially created by Quake fans who were so into Quake and how hardcore and what a really skillful game it was, that when they had LAN parties, they would try and put on a tournament at the LAN party, say, let's see who the best at this LAN party is, and then you battle there, and then let's make it spicier, let's have it, you enter some money, and then you win some prize money for the number one guy here, or you win a trophy, and then someone else thinks, right, well, I'll attract people to my LAN party who are the best players, so the best players are coming. I have the cachet of being able to say that by actually putting some prize money on the line. I've got a little sponsor of a graphics card or a processor that's the prize, or a prize and £100 or $100 or whatever it might be. And so in this sort of world, it was just aficionados of Quake setting up the tournaments. Therefore, what is the game they picked? Well, that's the point. They didn't pick a game. It was Quake because that was the game that initially spurred them to want to do it. Now, the key distinction to be made here is they were already Quake fans, wanted to do a tournament like Quake, therefore Quake's the game they used. They never picked Quake and thought, well, that's going to be the biggest game, this is the game that makes the most sense. So as a result, it wasn't people that were picking the most marketable game. They weren't thinking, what's the best game I could pick to get sponsors, and what would the crowd want to see, and what could get me a really good venue, and what would be good for my future, and what could I make money off going forwards. They weren't thinking of any of these factors. They were just thinking, well, I like Quake, so I'm going to put on a tournament. Which obviously is very different from how the world is now, where it goes by what the games are that can be exploited in terms of massive fan base, League of Legends, or in terms of current hype, Overwatch, whatever, CSGO, or it goes in terms of games where you can directly monetize sponsors. Sponsors want to be associated with this game over this game, or they feel like this game carries the right demographic for them, whereas this one doesn't over here, or it's in the right regions. These are all different factors that were never at play when Quake was the number one game. You've got to consider as well that if you are really fair, you can't look at Quake and go, it was number one, therefore it was doing something right. And then Counter-Strike and StarCraft 2 and League of Legends, they're doing something right as well. So if we can figure out what they're doing right and apply it to Quake, Quake could be where they are on number one again, which is what Quake fans, unfortunately, have done throughout time, because it's a very linear way of thinking. What they don't stop to think is, that's a key distinction, isn't it? That Quake was number one and there was no Counter-Strike. Then Counter-Strike came along. And then Quake and Counter-Strike, they were existing. Counter-Strike was number one. And then you know what? Then StarCraft 2, Warcraft 3, whatever, came along. And then you know what? StarCraft 2 was number one, and then League of Legends came along. And then you know what? League of Legends was number one, and now CSGO's here, and Dota 2's here. And Overwatch is on the way. They never stopped to think that, wait a minute, if there was only Quake in the beginning, you didn't have the option to play Counter-Strike, did you? So stop and think about it. If everyone was playing Quake, but that was pretty much one of the only options, some of those people, when Counter-Strike came out, probably went and played Counter-Strike, right? Or new people came along and they had the option between Quake and Counter-Strike and they play Counter-Strike. Or they came along, they didn't even hear about Quake, they just saw Counter-Strike and they play Counter-Strike. So what you have to do is think of those other people and now imagine that Counter-Strike and Quake existed from day one. And in this world, obviously, I mean, by the way, it couldn't actually exist because Counter-Strike was based on the Quake engine, or Half-Life was at least, but you get the point. The point is, if that had existed initially, some people in the same mechanism would have chosen Counter-Strike over Quake initially, so Quake would have been smaller. Some people would have played Quake, gone, this is too hard, I don't like this enough, oh, Counter-Strike, oh, that appeals to me more, and would have switched to Counter-Strike. Counter-Strike probably, if it existed at the same time, which obviously couldn't really happen, this is a hypothetical thought experiment, could have been bigger than Quake at the time if it existed, as it was very shortly afterwards when it came along. Likewise, World of Warcraft, StarCraft 2, Dota 2, League of Legends. These games, if they had existed at the time, would have eaten away at Quake's market base, overall market saturation. People would have played them instead, would have probably become more popular than Quake. So Quake, in a weird way, wasn't shaped by the market forces that modern day games are, and as a result, was a grassroots game on a small level, but not on the same level that something like Counter-Strike and future games League of Legends have been in their own way in terms of real grassroots games that have got millions, and then it forces the esports world to take account of it. People were doing esports stuff there. Even if Quake had been tiny, they might have done those esports things because they loved the game so much. So then, after looking at those kind of like, once I lay them out, fairly obvious environmental factors that made Quake number one, and as a result of no longer existing in any sense, and different environmental factors determining what top esports games are, this obviously just on this level alone, why Quake and Quake-style games can't be number one again, right? But there's more to look at. So let's look at some of the factors that surround making a game that's number one, okay? So, first and foremost, as I said, Quake wasn't even really designed as a multiplayer game, and it definitely was not thought out on the multiplayer side or planned particularly well. And the things that were even successful and to this day are well loved about Quake and Quake World and Quake 2 and Quake 3 and Quake Live are essentially not things that were planned and then used the same way by the end user who ended up playing them, or what they ended up enjoying about it is not necessarily the way that was intended to be used. And so one of the issues with this is it means that when it comes to making sequels to Quake or to tapping into the success that Quake had but in a later time, it's more difficult because you never really intended it. There was some accidental happenstance nature of it. And so there isn't really a secret to making Quake even very good or a Quake-style game number one. And as a result, there's no set path or formula that you can follow. It's also the fact that Quake traditionally is an incredibly difficult game. So different ways of saying that. It has a very high and varied skill ceiling. There are lots of different things you have to be very good at. There are lots of things you can get very good at within it. Lots of things you can do. As a result, it has a very steep learning curve. This puts off casual players. This is something that a lot of people understand now after trying to get their friends into the game. The problem with very steep learning curves, especially when they then put off casual players, especially when the best, most boiled down essence of really great Quake, unfortunately in the modern day, ever since the early days of Quake World stopping being the number one Quake game even, and Quake 2, Quake 3 taking over, has always been 1v1. And 1v1 is the most extreme version that puts off casual players the most because of how dominant that skill ceiling and factor can be between even two players who are very similarly matched. One can be 5% better and he might just dominate the other guy almost every time and by a massive score. What that means is, for casual players and lesser players, the players who are lower down the rung, remember, whenever you look at those ranking things for different games, whatever it might be, Counter-Strike, League of Legends, Overwatch, whenever they have all the different tiers, what you always find is the bottom tiers that aren't the very good players make up like 80% of the entire player base. So the game has to be fun for the 80% of the entire player base. If you want the game to be huge and then through being huge become viable to be exploited by sponsors and the esports industry. If that 80% isn't enjoying the game, it's not going to be a very popular game. You're probably not going to have that 80%. I mean, obviously I don't mean percent. I mean like the literal number that makes up the 80%. So the game has to be fun for that percent. The problem is the most extreme esports versions of Quake aren't fun for that 80%. They're the people who have the least fun and have very little fun if you could make objectively a scale of how much fun you're having in the game, because you get shit on. And the big problem here is there's very little short-term satisfaction or gratification to be had from getting wrecked as this guy who's slightly worse than the other guy, or is just in that bottom 80%, or is in that 80% who aren't the elite level players, who aren't at the top level of the ranks if you had a ranking system properly in Quake the way you do in the other games. In contrast, in games like League of Legends and Counter-Strike, there's a lot more fun to be had for those worse players. It's not as big of a deal when you get crushed. You don't get crushed by as much. The skill cap isn't as high. There isn't as much of a steep learning curve in the same sense. Obviously, League of Legends has a information burden because of how many champions there are. But in terms of the things you can do with them and how much you can get dominated, not as much. And so I always tell this story. It was a great story that I read on ES Reality, obviously the old school Quake community site for many, many years now, more than a decade. What am I talking about? More than a decade? Well, more than like 16 years or something. So there's a great story I once read there which really summed up the modern mentality and why the modern mentality of the average casual gamer won't ever be suited to Quake. So what happened was, all the people on this site, okay, have been around Quake, like I say, 15 years, 10 years, 7 years. To them, there isn't esports. They play Quake and they enjoy Quake and they think Quake's the most fun game. And I understand them because on the most base level, I agree with them. And what happens is, when you played Quake, you're buying into the idea that Quake's a hard game. It's a game with a high skill ceiling. It's got a steep learning curve. You're going to spend a lot of time learning it because you know in the long run, there's going to be a long-term payoff for getting really good at the game, which is when you play that guy who's slightly better than you and who's wrecking you now, when you get to his level, suddenly he's not wrecking you anymore and he wrecks you less. And then eventually you overtake that guy by becoming more skilled, putting in more effort, developing the game more. Now you're wrecking him and now you're facing another guy. So it's more a back-end payoff of skill as opposed to front-end of having just some fun fucking around like modern day games are. So what happens is, in this scenario, we who play the game have already just bought into that mindset. That's the matrix we live in. We think, well, obviously everyone who plays Quake understands that, you try to get better and you're not going to be good right now, but that's the whole point. It's such a varied game, it's such a skilled game that you have to put in a lot of hours to improve and you're going to see improvement in the future. What they don't understand is it's vital to that casual player that he has that payoff on the front end when he first plays the game. And so there was a story I read where a guy, he had like a friend or a cousin or something come round and he said to this kid, I'll load up Quake, because he's played Quake Live, I think. He said, play Quake Live or Quake 3, whichever it was. He said, like, you play it like free for all for a little while. Like, I'm going to go out for half an hour and I'll come back. And he told him, like, this is how you move the mouse. Like, here's your sensitivity set up. Here's the keys for the weapons and stuff. Comes back after half an hour. And he says to his cousin or his friend or whatever, like, did you enjoy it? And his friend says something like, yeah, it was all right. Yeah, no, it wasn't bad, actually. And then he says, all right, so what did you think then? And he says, oh, well, thing is, like, yeah, it was okay to play. But the problem is, I was playing and I was like, and these guys were wrecking me. And I was just thinking, like, well, I mean, this is kind of bullshit, isn't it? Like, why can't I compete? Now, that mindset and the way he phrased that there is so perfect. That's why I've remembered the gist of the story to this day, and I'll probably paraphrase some of it. Because the key detail there is, to this player, he didn't understand why he couldn't just jump into a server with people who could have been playing Quake for years, 10 years even in some cases, people who know all the things he doesn't know, people who've played the map even a bunch of times, and he didn't understand why. Sure, he didn't want to necessarily win and think he should win, but he should at least be able to compete, right? He should be up there and score. He should be killing this guy. This guy kills him, he should be able to kill him back. He should have a chance to win the game. It should be exciting. He didn't understand the concept that he's not going to get the short-term payoff, that there's not a low skill ceiling, that he's not going to bullshit fluke his way to a win. In the same sense as when you play against Roger Federer in tennis, I mean, even though he's old, he'd still wreck all of us, obviously, we would have no chance. We would get brutally wrecked. He would just toy with us, and there would be no chance in the game that he would lose. Like, he could fuck with us, and we could get the odd point here and there, but he's never going to lose the game. He could always win the game. That's how skilled tennis is. That's how high the skill ceiling is, and that's how steep the learning curve is, and how much variety is what you have to be amazing at, and how much experience you need at the game to be able to even play versus someone like him. In a game like Counter-Strike, sure, you would get wrecked by Olofmeister. You would get dominated, etc. But, you know what? Compared to the tennis game, you got a way better chance against Olofmeister. You can get some kills on Olofmeister. You could maybe, if you were actually vaguely close to his level, get lucky and win the game in a 1v1 or even a match against Olofmeister in some sense. As in, if you were playing in a 5v5 game, just as you might in League of Legends or Overwatch or CSGO, and Olofmeister's on the other team, and otherwise the teams are even, and then you're on the other team and the teams are even, difference is, you could be like 700 players lower than Olofmeister, and you might be able to win that. You might be able to every now and then bullshit upset that match. The difference is, if you're 700 ranking points below Roger Federer, you won't beat him in the game. It's just not going to happen. It's statistically unlikely in compared to it that it just wouldn't happen for you. So this problem is the difference between sport and casual activity. And unfortunately, a lot of modern day games have the sporting level at the very top level where you get the elite 1% playing each other, but a lot of the rest of it is more casual activity. It's more fun. It's more a hobby. It's more something to do for a joke than it is the hardcore sport with super hard. And this is the key difference in mentality. And the modern player is not going to accept that. They're not going to dedicate themselves to that sport. They want to play the fun game where they have a chance to compete, where they can just jump right in there. And from day one, they're getting kills, they're getting achievements, they're doing things in the game. This is not what Quake is about at all. And actually, I don't really see a way to make Quake about this, because to do so is to sap what makes Quake unique in itself. And therefore, you'd have a poor man's version of another game, whereas Quake is trying to, unfortunately, be the best at being that hardcore game and find a niche within the industry. And at the moment, it doesn't have a niche, and that's where its strengths lie. So you can't take away from its strengths, compromise, give to its weaknesses, because then it won't succeed either, because the other games do what its weaknesses are better than Quake does, even if you bolstered and shored up some of that. And in doing so, you take away from the charm of being Quake, so why even bother playing at that point in time? So here's the thing. Even if you add in those other community aspects that make those other games great, that are casual games now, that make them very popular, matchmaking, ladder/ranking systems, all these factors lend themselves to other games more. They don't seem to work that well in Quake anyway, because of the nature of the game. And again, just putting that stuff in isn't the reason why those games are the best. There's other factors like how difficult the game is, how many people want to play it. So there's other factors. Those help it. They're certainly, they emphasize and bring out the best qualities in the game and make it the experience more streamlined and quick and easy to play and all the rest of it, and not as difficult as finding a Quake server and all the rest of it. But they added to Quake will not transform Quake overnight and make it a good game. They probably should be added, but they won't be the key reason why. Just because those factors that existed in those other games didn't exist in Quake is irrelevant ultimately. Then you got to add in that some of the other great things about Quake was the creativity of the game. I mean, think about it. The mapping of Quake, all the different maps that were created and some of the fantastic additions we had. Sure, competitive scene stifled that to some degree, but they got stifled even more in modern Quake. Like in Quake Live, it's not even like the old games, because now the servers are made and created by id. So it's not like before where you owned your own server. You ran the server there, and therefore you put whatever maps you want on there. You can put a custom map on there. There was a lot more freedom in the past to at least expand the interest and maintain interest in Quake itself. That even the Quake series now does not exist like it did in the past. Likewise, modding is not as freely available now as it was in those old versions where you could mod the game and make it different. Funny thing is, Counter-Strike grew out of a Quake mod. Action Quake 2, and there was actually like another game, some sort of like marine type game for the first Quake that was like similar. Maybe it was called Action Quake itself. No, it was called something else, I'm pretty sure. It looked like Counter-Strike a little bit because it had like MP5s in and stuff. But basically, Action Quake 2 took the Quake 2 engine and added in some features that later on became Counter-Strike, because Gooseman was involved in Action Quake 2 at the end, and he's the guy who made Counter-Strike. So modding is very important. That's where you can get a new aspect of the game coming forwards. Then you got to add in tournaments outside of id Software. Have never really had id Software's proper support. They haven't played any sort of role in trying to build up the global scene. They've just let other people do these things. Well, that worked in the past of esports, but ever since about 2011 onwards, when you had like StarCraft 2 and then especially League of Legends coming in, now developers started taking more of a hand in it. Developers had to pay the prize money or had to start putting stuff up themselves. It wasn't just up to a tournament to get all the sponsorship and do it that way. That model's kind of played out at this point in time. So you got to add in, when you're talking about how the game's going to do, what involvement's the developer going to have? Well, id Software has done a very poor job of understanding how to monetize Quake in an esports sense and make a lot of money. They don't really seem to understand what items can they make, what customizables, what cosmetics can they make that people would want to buy. They've never understood how to crowdfund the game, so they can't get what CSGO has or what Dota 2 has with the compendiums, or CSGO with the skins, or skin gambling and all this. They haven't thought of any new innovations in that particular sense, or even managed to implement those things, and so they can't really make much money back. So to some degree, I can understand why they just sort of make the game and then give up on it after that, or just give like the most minimal attention they can, because how are they going to make the game bigger in that sense? How are they going to make money off it? They haven't got the particular vehicle in place that these other games have and that these other developers have developed themselves. Then you got to add in id Software as a company. id Software as a company, the best way to describe them throughout their history is small company that just makes games, largely single player games, just makes games, and that's it. And because they make games, they make a game, they move on to the next game. Sure, they might maintain the game, they might have like community people, but ultimately their next job is to make the next game. They're not about making one game, then that running for 15 years, and then running every aspect of it and maintaining it and making patches and changing the weapons and balancing things, and then running tournaments, and then thinking how we're going to monetize over here and making the whole business about this and making hundreds of millions of dollars. They're not about that, and they never really have been. So I would actually contrast the whole Quake thing. I've got an analogy for you. This is a good way to think of it, okay? I would contrast it with the music industry. Because in the 1970s, Led Zeppelin could not only be the best band, obviously my opinion, but a general consensus, but also the biggest band in the world. Simultaneously, they could be arguably the best band and the biggest band, the most popular, the most widespread. They could be these two things at once. And you could have massive success and massive artistic success all at once. Nowadays, that generally doesn't happen and almost can't happen. The reason why it almost can't happen is because pop music dominates popular music, and the problem there is, just to specify, when I say pop music, I obviously mean like catchy stuff written specifically to be like this, and short attention span, and hitting on certain jingles and catchy things, so immediately off the bat you're into it, and that's what I mean by pop music, because obviously pop music originally comes from popular music, but pop music itself is the most popular type of music. It dominates the charts, it dominates people's attention, it's everywhere, it's ubiquitous in all of culture, in a way that a band like Led Zeppelin wasn't in, because marketing didn't exist to the same degree back then, but they would have had that role back then. Now it's pop music that's in that position, and someone like a Led Zeppelin would never get as big as that. They could get decently big, they could get okay big, or they could be like a cool underground band who do great live shows, or they could be like Tool or something, who come back every now and then and do an album and have their own niche following that's big for a niche, but it's still a niche of the overall wide world of people who buy Rihanna and Chris Brown or whatever the fuck else. But they're never going to be the Led Zeppelin of the world, are they? And so the point here is, the reason why Led Zeppelin, if they came along now, wouldn't be as big, in the same way as Quake can't be as big now, is because the modern music, like pop music, is actually specifically designed to be hits, to be popular. That is the end goal. They're reverse engineering it being popular, and they're taking chances with a bunch of different people for very low cost, and they've taken low risks on the contracts with these people, so that the ones that take off become successful. It's like trying to make viral videos. People said you couldn't do it. Yeah, you can't just make one video only and then have it become viral, but you can make a bunch of them, follow different themes, figure out certain mechanisms, and eventually you can have some that are viral and viral to different degrees, and then you just have to have the one that goes really big, and you make back all your money, recoup it all, and you get all the interest you want. The difference is, Led Zeppelin, that type of a person, or a Quake's trying to be a really difficult game, a really good game, a really unique, amazing game. Led Zeppelin's trying to do really good art. They're trying to really express themselves in a certain way. They're not trying to reverse engineer success and hits and stuff. So they're less likely to get it in that particular sense, where that's what dominates the market. And that's what determines how you navigate this world and how big your brand comes, etc. Now, sure, it would be great for someone like me if Led Zeppelin was the biggest band in the world. It would be great for someone like me if Quake was the biggest game. They're the games I prefer the most. But actually, I understand that for the casual viewer, that's not what they want. They want something that picks up immediately and they get the snappy little jingle. It's a little bit similar to what there was a year ago, but it's not quite the same. It's got a catchy new hook on it, and people are into this sound of this one DJ, so they've got another producer who's a little bit like him to bring something in there. And the lyrics don't need too much. They don't need to necessarily sit with you for too long. You're getting them at the early on, and they're quite light and stuff. I understand in this sense. Same with the games where someone wants to jump in and play League of Legends or Overwatch or whatever it is. They don't want to get super hard into the game and figure out the sensitivity and the railgun, and then, oh, how do I set up this particular jump over to the mega health here? Oh, and I can't do that, so I'm not ever going to be as good at duel. Like, they don't want all this stuff. I get it, okay? So you got to think to yourself, the perspective of the casual guy, how he's ever going to get really into Quake, in the same way as how would he really get into Led Zeppelin in that scenario. So in terms of the kid now, think about this. Sure, if this music existed now, if it's not in the charts and everywhere, it's going to be hard for him to hear it, but he might hear about through underground means, right? But it's not going to be the biggest game. It's not going to be the biggest music then, is it? Likewise, how is this kid who comes along going to hear about Quake? He's going to hear about Overwatch, his friends might tell him about. He's going to hear about League of Legends, he might hear about it or see tournaments or read an article about it in the news or see a video online. How's he going to see about Quake? He's never going to get to that. It's going to be 50th in line. He might never even get to it, even if he follows League of Legends for 10 years. He might just never see the words Quake, might never hear about it. Might hear about it vaguely. It's not going to encounter it in the same way. And as a result, Quake's never going to be the number one game.